Hello, everyone. Welcome to Right Off Track podcast, where we explore the extraordinary journeys of individuals who have dared to embrace unconventional paths on their personal success journey. I'm your host, Anya Smith, and today get ready to be inspired by an exceptional trailblazer. Meet Jackson Kerchis, an author, instructor, executive coach, and self-proclaimed happiness nerd. His journey began in the world of business, but it took an unexpected turn when he pivoted to create the world's first bachelor's degree in happiness studies at the University of Alabama. Drawing from positive psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and more, Jackson's innovative approach to education was just the beginning. After a transformative period as a Zen monk, Jackson found his passion at the crossroads of well-being and organizational performance. As the managing partner at Happiness Means Business, he's on a mission to ignite workplaces and individuals alike. With a focus on military, first responders, transportation, sales, and healthcare, Jackson's impact is vast. In this episode, we'll delve into the fascinating learning happiness model, explore the insights he gained through his time as a Zen monk, and uncover the depths of his coaching, training, and consulting work. Jackson's journey is a testament to embracing one's unique passion and following them fearlessly. Let his story inspire you to tap into your limitless potential and create a life on your own terms, because if Jackson can do it, why not you? So I'm excited to welcome to Jackson himself. Welcome, Jackson. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
A pleasure, a pleasure. And we got to know each other through the Changing Work Collective. So I'm grateful that we have these conscious businesses who are coming together. And I was very intrigued, of course, by the happiness degree. I wish that was something that was out there. So could you tell us a little bit, like, how in the heck did you first find it to be like meaningful, right? And then create something like that where there's a degree on the subject, if you don't mind us starting there.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Well, I think it really came down to the sort of, it's top of mind for me because I was talking with a friend through this idea of like, what do I want to do with my life, which I feel is somewhat of a never ending question.
Yes.
And I was grappling with that very intensely. I think it was my sophomore year of college. I'd gone to the University of Alabama on scholarship. And I think at that point I was almost done with my economics degree. And I really just kept, having that issue of like, well, what do I want to do? What do I have to? And
Right.
I think I started to shift when I started to think, well, like, okay, I know that I can learn about anything. I'm sort of a nerdy type. And I was like, all right, well, what do I really want to learn about? Like, what's the most important thing? And I still remember one morning I just woke up and I was like, oh, I could study happiness. So I was like, everything that to study anything else is just a means to an end of happiness, isn't it?
Right.
So if I want to study finance or go to medical school or be a lawyer so that I can have a great career and have a good life in order to be happy. So I'm like, well, why don't I just study happiness and sort of cut out the middleman, so to speak? And once I decided that, I just, that's the direction I took. I took immediate action. And I was somewhat fortunate that the University of Alabama has a great program called New College that sort of facilitates creating your own major. Typically, it's more like a traditional major of, let's say you have neuroscience, but Alabama doesn't have neuroscience. So you put something together. Mine was from scratch. I think I broke their record for the most independent research credits. But that was it. It all came from that sort of insight.
I love that. And it reminds me of like the John Lennon quote where he talks about like his teacher asked him, what does he want to be when he grew up? And he's like, I want to be happy. And like, no, you don't understand the question. He's like, no, you don't understand life. I'm paraphrasing. Like, that's so true. Like we're striving to do all this great stuff, but hopefully the underlying theme is like, we want to feel fulfilled and we want to feel a certain way in our life versus just like the monetary things or the superficial things. But I'm curious, what was the response? Like when you're like, you know what? I have a degree idea. It's going to be about happiness. How did it go from like you being excited about it to actually showing the value behind it? Because we all want to be happy, but coincidentally, we take that as like a fluffy, potentially ideal and not like the hard ROI money behind it kind of thing.
Yeah. I would say I've been pleasantly surprised by the feedback I got because I had that same maybe concern or skepticism going into it. And I think I was almost surprised a little bit in that how much it immediately sort of resonated with people. I remember this was back in my college days. I was involved in management consulting. So we used to do these corporate visits and We were in Goldman Sachs in Dallas, and there was some lady who's like, "Hey, someone in here said on their resume that they're a happiness major. Who is that? Like, I want to talk to you." Right. So I think that there's some, even in the situations you would not expect, there's some inkling that on a deep level, it's easy for us to maybe get distracted or mistake achievement or progress or these other things for happiness. But when you actually just put it in front of someone, I think often we kind of realize like, oh, well, this is sort of life's most important subject, to paraphrase Mathieu Ricard. So yeah, I was surprised how much it did resonate. And I always tried to focus on saying, look, I'm interested too in how do you take an individual or a group of people and help them to be happier. Like, I'm not really interested in like a philosophical discussion of like, what is happiness, as much as it being very practical. So
I love that. And what has been the result of that? So now the program lives beyond you, right? If I understand it correctly. So there's actually people who aren't, who besides you have this major, right? Or degree kind of focus. Is that right? And kind of what have been some of the impact people who are going through this now, if you can share?
yeah, so the sort of legacy at Alabama, I elected to not sort of set it up as a ongoing major, just because honestly I was like, I don't think that everyone needs to major in happiness. But what we did do is I offer a course now through their continuing studies department, which is kind of an online course, somewhat similar to Laurie Santos's very popular Science of Wellbeing from Yale that kind of blew up on Coursera. They have an online curriculum, and that may be something I go back to, and I'm dabbling with maybe creating the first happiness PhD or something in the coming years. So
I'm thinking about it. I finished my second master's right now, and I was like, well, maybe down the line, maybe a PhD, but that would be something intriguing for me. I love it. But besides that degree, like now you've undertaken Happiness Means Business. I love the title. So kudos to you or whoever came up with that. So how has the focus from a degree evolved into this endeavor?
yeah, it's a great question. Well, it turns out there was somewhat of maybe a natural connection that at first I wouldn't have forecasted, but it works out quite well in that probably in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot more research that links happiness to performance. And particularly, I think about the work of Sean Aker, who had a very like viral TED talk in his book, The Happiness Advantage, right? And there are other positive psychologists who contributed to this, but it sort of was science finally came around to backing up intuition. And when I say that is, I mean, we tend to think, right, that when I feel good and I'm happy and I'm well rested and I'm emotionally stable, etc., I'm going to perform better. We all kind of, yeah, that makes sense. But what you see in, for instance, Sean Aker's work is that there's a very clear relationship that it's actually that happiness, and I'm sort of, we'll define happiness for now as abundance of positive emotion, leads to success. Happier people are more creative, they're more engaged, they're just generally more effective, they earn more money. And so that's kind of the work that we draw on at Happiness Means Business. Myself, my business partner, Paul, is whether we're working one-on-one with individuals or in organizations, we work military, kind of say, look, there are certain elements of happiness and well-being at the organizational level. And when we cultivate those, we're going to drive outcomes around not only obvious ones like recruitment and retention, but oftentimes actual performance benefits because people are in a more optimal emotional state.
Oh, that it was funny. Maybe it's just me, but when I think about the military and some of the people that you focus on, like I'm not like, oh, that is the happy group of people. And I don't mean that like it's just not like this subject, but I'm curious, like, can you challenge, like, can you share some of the misconceptions around happiness and kind of who is this course right for and the kind of impact it could have? Because I can think like, oh, well, like when I think about happiness, my first natural response is like, oh, I see that that's helpful for the military, but clearly there's really strong impact and value there, even in those kind of settings. So what are some of the misconceptions you have to challenge with your program?
Yeah, so I think it oftentimes depends on the audience of who the program or the intervention or whatever is for. Right? For instance, we worked with a very large trucking company around kind of safety focused outcomes, and so it's sort of like their maybe obstacles or misconceptions around happiness have a little bit more to do with like work-life balance, because it's a heavily seasonal industry, and during this peak season they're working like 80 hours a week, right? So that's maybe a little different to one of the first people I coached was the former CFO of a major hospital, and her issues were a lot more around sort of maybe being very achievement oriented and being a little bit burnt out and disengaged from her work. And then I would say military, some of the maybe misconceptions or things they've struggled with in the past has sort of been a somewhat what you expect with a military style of leadership that's somewhat more command and control. It tends to be a little bit more reserved and sort of lacking psychological safety or kind of even friendship, right? Which I sometimes am cautious about bringing that in when we work with clients. But I say, look, if you look at Gallup, who they are one of the world leaders in workforce engagement, one of the first questions they ask is, do you have a best friend at work? And on its face, you're like, what? Why would you ask that? But it's highly predictive of retention and engagement. So yeah, it definitely depends on the context. But I think generally it has a lot to do with getting clear on sort of what the outcome is besides just happiness, and then the specific context of the client.
I love that. And, my misconception around happiness is that happiness is like this fleeting state, right? Like we're happy in the moment, but how can you sustain that? And for me, like, I don't necessarily set expectations about happy as like a point of like achievement, like I'm happy and state, but more like contentment. I know that doesn't sound as sexy or happy. I mean, as glamorous, like, but I mean, like a sustainable level of I'm appreciating what I have right now versus defining like a future state that's temporary of achievement. So is there kind of a cultivation of that, maybe balance between contentment and happiness, where it's like a current state of good and a balanced state of being versus like this emotional fleeting state of happiness?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I've had, even the other day, my friend was sort of joking with me that it's like, oh, we were talking about even my own happiness. And he was saying, well, yeah, I think what you should be calling it is like the deep contentment or satisfaction. And I'm like, yes, maybe, yeah, probably, but
less sexy, right? That's the challenge.
I always liked happiness because it sort of hits you like, wait, happiness major. But there's an interesting model. Then there's many ways you can slice it. So Martin Seligman has PERMA, which is wonderful, where you say well-being or happiness is composed of positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, achievement. Tal Ben-Shahar has SPIRE, which is spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional health. I won't name all the models, but a very kind of useful one to get at your question, and it actually comes from Daniel Kahneman, who explains that we really have two different selves, and these two selves experience happiness or treat happiness differently. So use the example of you're on a first date and it's going really well for 2 hours, you're going to know one another. And then right at the very end, maybe you go in for like a hug and it's kind of awkward or something. So your experiencing self had, let's say, 2 hours of happiness. Right. But your remembering self is probably going to remember that whole date as kind of awkward or it didn't go well. And so you say, well, how is it then that I can have 2 hours of happiness, but then I remember it as unhappy? And it gets at this idea of experiencing versus reflecting. And when you kind of tease that out to, let's say, a self-assessment of happiness, they're actually somewhat different, because I could be, let's say maybe I have a fairly high status role and I'm very successful on paper, but I don't experience a lot of positive emotion. If you were to ask me, Jackson, with your life as a whole, are you happy? Are you satisfied? I pause and I reflect and say, well, based on where other people are and everything I have, I guess I am happy. But conversely, you could be experiencing a lot of positive emotions day to day. And then someone asks you, well, think about your life as a whole. And you're like, actually, well, I could be a little bit better. So there's sort of different factors that map to each one. But I ultimately think that happiness with a capital H, I sometimes say, is when you have both of those, right? You have sort of this reflective, cognitive, overall life satisfaction, feeling of accomplishment, etc. And then you're also smiling often and experiencing positive emotions day to day.
Yeah, I think it is a balance. And like, I think there's, again, that compassion. And that's where I caution myself from like viewing happiness as like this goal where if I'm not happy every moment, like then I'm failing. Like it doesn't have to be an extreme, but it's like looking at it from a broad spectrum of like, how can I be more content and happy and celebrate, the memories and the current state as much as possible, and kind of also try to balance it out where if it's one extreme or the other, what can I do to kind of bring it toward the middle? And if you mind me asking, like one thing that fascinates me, especially about corporate culture, is like there's a lot of challenges happening right now, especially with a lot of layoffs happening. Maybe it's just me because I was in the tech space, so it really hits home. But how do we help people in this situation where like there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of layoffs, there's this looming kind of like, psychological safety from even like COVID, and like a lot of stress is kind of compiling onto our lives. And then we go into our work and it's additional level of like, balancing expectations and the work demands. Like how do we show up happy in that sense? Like are there any learnings that you would recommend that's really helping people like right now with a very elevated sense of stress and their demands in their work?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe 3 points that come up for me. I mean, I always am big on starting with the kind of the foundations of the physical level, and that it's like I wish sometimes there was this more elegant and impressive happiness stuff, but a lot of what you see is like some of the most effective interventions are simply consistent exercise. So you look at, there was just a recent report, I think it was in the Washington Post, that referenced an article in some journal. I don't know. I just made a LinkedIn video about it, but I don't remember the details.
Check out
They,
LinkedIn.
yeah, they were explaining that a recent study found that for anxiety, exercise was pretty much equally as effective as a very commonly prescribed anti-anxiety medication. And that echoes previous sentiments around exercise, a ton of benefits to your brain as much as your body. Then you think about sleep. So Matthew Walker wrote a book, I believe, in 2 years ago. I think it was The Power of Sleep or something to that effect. But he's one of the world's leading experts on this, and it's basically 300 some pages of just telling you like everything in your health depends on sleep. And so I think often that sort of foundation is key for managing stress. Oftentimes, when you have a lot going on, it can feel very overwhelming and it sort of crowds in on you. And often the first things to go are having adequate time for mental and physical rest and recovery, having time to get some exercise, having time or having this sort of bandwidth to wind down and get a good night's sleep. So I start with prioritizing the foundation. I often say that your kind of physical energy is the foundation for these higher order levels of energy, whether it's cognitive, emotional, etc. Two other things to consider. One is stress is enhancing mindset. I know that's sort of in vogue right now, and I don't know all the different researchers. A friend of mine who I worked with once before, Jennifer Wegman, she does some work on that, but basically this idea that there's of course limits to this, but oftentimes we have a stress is debilitating mindset. But if you were to actually just review the scientific literature, it's kind of equally true that stress is enhancing. It just depends on the dosage. So having that attitude of stress is enhancing. And then a final one is I often think of as just comparison. And this one I'm less drawing from the literature and more just practical experience. But typically in the US, even if you're laid off or you're having some very, very serious emotionally draining challenges, right, the odds that you're going to starve, especially if you're coming from a, let's say, middle class corporate background or even lower middle class corporate background, are very low. So if you were to look at just even footage of what's going on in places like India, you have Africa, somewhat cliche, I know to say that, but it's true that oftentimes what we view as real stressors and problems, if we were to sort of view it from this third person, broader global context, very much like, wow, this is not so bad. And I do the same thing as myself as an entrepreneur. I'll be like, oh, now I have permission to be stressed because it's really serious. If I don't get these sales or get a new client, I'm going to not make money. And it's like, well, like I'm probably not going to ever be like, am I going to eat next week? Like it's all in here. So
Yeah, perspective is really powerful. I think sometimes I like sometimes like to add humor to my catastrophizing,
Yeah.
where it's like usually it ends up with like the meteor striking the world. Like
Hmm.
I'm like, okay, well this is gonna go here and this is really bad, and then like, let's take it like zombie apocalypse. The meteor is striking there. Like I want to like really get into my head like just how like even though it seems like reasonable, really it's
Hmm.
draining a lot of energy, and it is kind of silly at a certain point of time, like to worry about everything in the world at the same amount of time, like where honestly I only have so much control,
Yeah.
right? So I think like the stress that we take on has to be balanced for us to find some level of happiness and perspective. Like to your point, like hopefully things aren't as dire, right? And hopefully that reflection can give you a little bit of just like a breather from like, okay, if it's not going to be the end of the world in this situation, can I give myself a little bit of a piece to just like maybe calm myself, get some physical healing so I can respond to that situation better versus like feeding all this energy into it and then maybe like not having the capacity to actually solve it better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it reminds me, I saw this video the other day and I got a kick out of it, but they were showing a side, like it was back to back videos of LeBron James and Steven Adams, another NBA player during COVID. And LeBron was talking about, oh, it's so hard. You wouldn't believe it. We, get back to our rooms and we can't see our friends and family. And I'm just sitting there in these blank white walls. And I'm like, what's going on? And they
Mm-hmm.
cut to Steven Adams because this was during COVID, they had them in the bubble for the NBA
Yeah.
season. And Steven Adams goes, we're living in a resort. like we're not in Syria here,
Yeah.
right? And so I sometimes use that same sort of thought on myself. It's like I'm not in I'm living in a resort essentially. Like,
Yeah. Hey, Jackson, this was so much fun for me. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I hope to all of our listeners, like this gives you a sense like you can build your own path. If you were thinking like, oh, nobody teaches happiness, like, you could teach happiness, right? You could
yeah,
bring your own happiness insight into the world and make it impactful and make it mean business, just like Jackson is doing. So don't limit yourself, explore your own path, take time for reflection. And also, if this was interesting for you and you found some takeaways, don't just keep it to yourself. Share with a friend, share any questions you have for us, and connect with us so we can also be part of your journey if helpful. And as always, I really appreciate your time and thank you for coming right off track with us. We look forward to having you next time. And thank you again, Jackson.